Okay, so we're into chapter 11, the austral realm. And this looks like a fairly easy and straightforward chapter because the austral realm does not deal with, we're not dealing with a whole lot of countries. In fact, we're really just dealing with Australia and New Zealand. But there's still a lot to take in here because consider that both these have colonial histories. In the sense that there's a lot of European ties because of the settlement that occurred in both Australia and New Zealand. But both these countries are becoming more and more tied in with Southeast Asia, just by virtue of location, by virtue of changing population, demographics, and just by virtue of the ascendance economically of the nearby Southeast Asian realm. So pay attention to those tie-ins. And of course, also pay attention to the contrasts. You know, we think that Australia and New Zealand are perhaps the same because they were settled by Europeans. They have their unique issues with Aboriginal populations, which you should pay attention to. And also just think about the different physiography between Australia and New Zealand. New Zealand is a volcanic island, whereas Australia is actually in the middle of a plate and is actually home to some of the oldest rocks on Earth. So Australia is not tectonically active the way New Zealand is. Of course, that leads to differences in agriculture and just slightly different cultural differences. So pay attention to that as well. Okay, so again, the austral realm is made up of Australia, which is the dominant player here, at least in geographic size, and then New Zealand. You can tell that they're much different in size and much different physiographically, as I was mentioned. The fact that Australia sits in the middle of a plate. Notice where the population is. The population is really clustered in both these countries around the coast. So there's a high level of urbanization of the population. The difference is that what causes people to settle along the coast in Australia is because most of the interior of the country is very, very arid. It's all low relief, meaning not very flat, very dry. Whereas in New Zealand, the reason why people settle near the coast is that this is a volcanic island. The islands originate from volcanic activity. It's very mountainous in the interior of the country, so therefore people settle near the coast. Not being tectonically active, that means that Australia is quite stable. That's not the case in the case of New Zealand, which is prone to earthquakes quite frequently, and a large one occurring in about 2011, which had major impact on Christchurch. Okay, though they are lumped into the same region, you can see that the difference in latitude and in topography makes a big difference climatologically for both Australia and New Zealand. Australia is much more arid, whereas New Zealand has a lot more rainfall and therefore is a much more temperate climate. Okay, the book makes the point that despite the fact that it's not listed on a lot of maps or globes, there is a southern ocean. You know, quite often maps and globes depict the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean as extending all the way to Antarctica. However, locals, folks who live in the region, will make the distinction and say there is a southern ocean, essentially because there is a unique temperature, salinity, fauna, chemistry of the water that surrounds the Arctic. And there is a distinguishable boundary when seen from above, when you fly over it. That boundary does tend to drift and change depending on the season, etc. But there is a distinct nature to the water that surrounds Antarctica that makes it distinguishable from the other bodies of water. Do you ever wonder why kangaroos are only found in Australia? Some species of tree kangaroos are found in New Guinea. But why is that? I encourage you to read the section on page 457, as Australia is a unique case study in evolutionary biology, particularly mammalian evolution. And as far as human evolution goes in Australia, it appears to have started around 50,000 years ago in an Aboriginal population came in and changed the landscape, the animal landscape quite a bit. And then, of course, there was a second wave of immigration as Europeans moved into the continent as well. I encourage you to check out this 4-slide animation about essentially biogeography. It mentions that islands are of particular interest to biogeographers because there are so many plants, sometimes called flora, and animals, fauna, that are unique to Australia. Okay, if you look at the map of Australia and its states, pretty good indication of colonialization. So the Aboriginal populations were essentially marginalized, pushed well into the Northern Territory, which is where the main number of Aborigines are in Australia today, or essentially the population was essentially decimated, particularly when you look at the island of Tasmania. Okay, so on pages 458 going into 459, it essentially just talks about how Australia is structured governmentally. And it is a federation, not unlike European federations, but unlike the European model where essentially it's a unitary state where you have a centralized government. In Australia, it is more of a commonwealth of states where there are different viewpoints, economies, and objectives in each of the states. Okay, and the analogy is drawn to the United States in the sense that the United States had an indigenous population, the Native Americans, who were marginalized, their land taken, and any kind of reparations were rather substandard. They were given kind of the worst lands, the reservations that are don't have access to a lot in the way of natural resources. Same thing in Australia. There's been a lot of inequity in how the Aboriginal populations have been treated. Check out the section on page 459 going into 460 about distance, the role of distance. First of all, the enormity of the Australian country, the size of it, means that there's not infrastructure that connects all different parts, and therefore it can be quite expensive to travel or to ship goods within the country. And of course, the remoteness of the continent also makes it relatively expensive to ship goods to and from with the outside world. However, there is an advantage in the sense that it has kept Australia isolated from a lot of conflict geopolitically. Of course, there's also the issue with immigration, and on page 460 it mentions that in beginning of 1901 there was a white Australia policy that essentially operated to prevent immigration from becoming an issue. And some of those some vestiges of that policy weren't officially terminated until 1978. As was mentioned before, there's a high level of urbanization in Australia. Most of the population is centered in towns and cities along the border or the coast of Australia. Most of the inland area, which is called the outback, has very, very small population. Okay, so the city of Sydney is featured on page 461 of your textbook, and one thing that's mentioned is, of course, the natural advantage of Sydney is that it's got one of the best natural harbors in the world. And this will become a bigger player, a bigger factor as Australia continues to increase its amount of trade with Southeast Asia and with the rest of the world. Okay, so what does Australia have to trade with the world? Well, certainly agriculture is one of its strong suits, agriculture and livestock. It also is minerally rich, and that becomes a big factor, especially with the ascendance of China and India, relatively nearby, that are in need of resources. So look for Australia to become a bigger trading partner with those things. Where Australia lags behind is in manufactured goods. Quite often the resources are taken from Australia and then the finished goods are sold back to Australians. Okay, so this slide just kind of reemphasizes the point made on page 463 that Australia's economy is really based on exporting its raw materials. So its growth, its affluence are paid for by mines and farms. There is some tourism. There is some commodity exports. They mentioned some value-added products such as wine that are an export. But for the most part, outside countries see the affluent Australian market as a growth area where goods, value-added goods, can be sold to Australians. Okay, as box 11.6 on page 466 begins, it says the Aboriginal population totals just under 700,000 today and remains marginalized within Australian society. Not unlike the situation with Native Americans in the United States, land ownership and entitlement are important and contentious issues. Now notice that the majority of Aborigines live in the Northern Territory, where the Aboriginal population makes up about 29.8% of the overall population. But Aboriginal issues are going to become a bigger and bigger issue for Australia in general, especially when you start to consider mineral rights, access to energy development. So this is not a problem that's going away. And I encourage you to read the little pro-con section on page 467 about Aboriginal rights in Australia. It is important to recognize that despite the European colonization of Australia and despite the Aboriginal population of Australia, those are not the only two groups that make up Australia. There are immigrants, particularly an increasing number of immigrants from Southeast Asia and from South Asia. And so think about, how do immigrants benefit Australia? What kind of problems come with immigrants? And do you think Australia is better equipped to handle immigrants than other regions of the world? Another 21st century challenge for Australia is climate and climate change. If you read pages 464, 465 of your textbook, it talks about how Australia can be at the whim of El Nino events, which can cause prolonged either droughts or extreme flooding in the country. This is a very interesting video. Essentially, it's about fighting fire with fire, how Aboriginal techniques of burning undergrowth on a periodic basis can prevent out of control huge wildfires, and in the long run can actually reduce the number of greenhouse gases that are emitted to the atmosphere. So what's next for Australia? Again, it was initially colonized by the British, part of the British Commonwealth. That could be ending as the economic ties between Australia and the Western world become less important when compared to the growing economic ties between Australia and the South Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asian realms. Of course, Australia is also interested in maintaining strong diplomatic ties with the United States, again, to act as a counterweight to the growing influence of China. Okay, so New Zealand is the other main country in this austral realm, and it's composed of two major islands, the North Island and South Island, both volcanic in origin and both home to ongoing tectonic activity. So just like Australia, New Zealand is essentially a land of peripheral development. Most of the development and agriculture occurs on the outskirts, the coastal areas, because the interior section of New Zealand is so mountainous. The terrain is just not habitable, or you can't farm it very effectively. Similarly, with Australia, there is a native population called the Maori, who have been marginalized, but the land claims, the mineral claims, and making reparations to this displaced and underserved population will become a bigger factor in coming decades.